Lords of War, Orcs vs. Dwarves, Volume 1. Written by Martin Vaux and read by Tom Barratt. Part 6. Stoking Low Fires. Geld awoke with fine ash on her lips, the last kiss of the dead. The events of the night before came surging back to her like air through bellows. Grubnar's last look before he fell. The digging, the hiding. She had covered herself over with earth the best she could manage, dragging the dining table over and tipping it over the crude burrow she had hollowed out. Once covered, she had continued to dig, piling earth over herself, feeling her fingernails getting sore, bleeding, wet earth sliding into her wounds. There had been silence then for hours, and she had felt the earth around herself begin to warm as the homestead above her had burned. In her mind, she had held the thought that at any moment she might be discovered, or that worse, she would die there, baking underground like slow-cooked meat, and would never be found. At some point during the night she must have slipped into a deep sleep. She felt at her face, touched her cheeks, and realized they were caked with mud and ash. It had mingled with her tears of desperation, forming a grim war paint more fierce than woad. Slowly, she started to shift the earth above her, trying as carefully as possible to prevent her hastily constructed hiding place from collapsing. In the pitch black, time seemed to lose meaning, but she felt time passing by, thick and hot as molten tar. As she worked, teeth gritted, throat dry, she thought of the gods. She had never had faith, but she had knelt and prayed, told them secrets, made them promises. All of those gestures seemed like folly now. To see Grubnar again felt to her like an impossibility. All that mattered was vengeance, and when vengeance was wrought, death would be welcome to take her. Her fingertips eventually burst out into the sunlight, and an arid hot breeze hit her. Awkwardly she clambered out of the earth and saw around her utter devastation. The roof of their home was gone. The front wall had fallen in, and around her half-burnt, fallen beams lay inside what was left of the building like broken bones. Grubnar's body was nowhere to be found. The ground was littered with their belongings, smashed and burned, lost amongst piles of cracked stone and ash. She looked out into the fields. What had been only yesterday acres of limp corn was now blackened and twisting, or simply just gone. There was no sign of the cattle. She presumed they were lost, but she didn't much care. Pulling her filthy dress around her and dusting off the worst clumps of mud, she scrambled through the destruction, out of the house and onto the pathway outside. Fires were still smouldering, adding a haze to the sky, but she could see, from the location of the sun, that it was almost midday. Up above the clouds, a falcon was circling. As she watched it gliding in the updrafts created by the immolation of her life, she smiled grimly. The bird then let out a mighty screech and turned in the air, diving towards her with lightning speed. As the shape of the falcon grew larger, its wings suddenly unfurled and its descent slowed. Talons extended. It seemed to be flying towards her, and she felt her heartbeat quicken. Eyes wide, she thought to turn and run, but before a decision was made, the bird had lost momentum completely, coming to rest but a few feet in front of her. Looking down at the animal, Gelda thought again about the gods. The falcon looked up with its severe, beady eyes and snapped its beak. It screeched, extending its wings and flapping them clumsily, seeming to struggle, maintaining its balance. Eventually Gelda thought to speak to the bird, but she held her tongue. Instead she decided to start walking, because Ragnar's Folly was well over half a day's walk, and she didn't want to be caught out in the open come nightfall. It seemed impossible, but orcs were abroad, and she knew now that meant that outside of an outpost no dwarf could truly be safe. The falcon took notice of Gelda's movements, and to her surprise the bird began to hop along awkwardly beside her. Its pace was slower than hers, but intermittently it would take a short flight, gliding up again or falling behind further, taking stock always of their surroundings. As the journey wore on, Gelda's feet became sore. Her whole body ached, her heart most of all. Intermittently, as she drove onwards, she lost sight of her surroundings completely through a veil of welling tears. On several occasions, once she had cleared her view, she would look for the falcon, and it would be nowhere to be seen. Then, from high above, it would screech down towards her, letting her know, or so it felt, that her coast, although perilous, was clear. At the highest point of the highest tower of Ragnar's Folly, which wasn't very high and wasn't much of a tower at all, Crod Clouthammer sat in his quarters, smoking his pipe. The pipe had been carved by his grandfather from a great whalebone. His family had been whalers for generations, until his father had broken the mould and joined the Legion. The pipe had seen battle. The deep carvings on its side had become packed and filled with filth and memories, and one day, when his father had died, the pipe had been handed down to him. Sucking at the end of the pipe, Crod could taste the salt water, the freezing depths, the icebergs, and the howling, savage cruelty of the winds. He missed them daily, missed them in a way which meant that, try as he might, he never felt comfortable. His bones knew, or so he believed, where they belonged. The keep at Ragnar's Folly was ready to be evacuated. If it were up to him, the whole force would be pulled back. They had no more functioning barges, let alone tall ships, and the deep woods seemed a long distance to drag bows without a ship's smith at the outpost to guide the next moves. From the north, there were open plains. From the east, there were open plains. From the south, there were open plains. To the west, there were the tireless seas. Inside the fort, there was madness. From the safety of his office, Crod delivered orders. He sent out sentries and rangers, planned and ordered drills, sent off requests for supplies, men, assistance. For a time he would drink to help him think, and for a while he drank to stop himself from thinking. Moon after moon rose up and died. Infants were born, and the old men died or fell lame. His life slipped away like pipe smoke, disappearing into the air with the ease and speed of feckless mortality. The pipe had died in his fingers. He laid it down and thought back to life in the High Court. He thought of the grooming, the dress uniforms, the ceremonial weapons. He smiled grimly, imagining the idea of ever trying to kill a foe with one of those axes. The idea was ridiculous. Those dwarves, they were like children, playing with toys. He was distracted from his reverie by the sound of tapping at the window. Turning to look, he saw a beak, curved like a fay blade, scrabbling for attention. The aging general stood and opened the window for the beast, which flew into his chamber gracefully, landing almost perfectly, spilling only an inkwell, which rolled off of the table and spread black ink in a dramatic rolling arc over the flagstones.
"Now that was unnecessary,"
said Crod, leaning down to pick up the trinket.
"I can only presume that Master Haddon has sent you."
As Crod stood up, placing the inkwell back onto the table, he noticed that the bird seemed to be struggling with something. He moved in closer, watching the animal shift its weight, rootling and scratching at the table's top with its savage beak.
"Now what's this?" continued the general. "Have you brought a message? I can't see a message tied to your leg, so what am I to think?"
Crod, who until this point had been half muttering to himself, suddenly stopped speaking. The bird had completed its duties. It stood back from its work proudly, looking up at the enormous-seeming dwarf, the two locking eyes in an instant of pure horror. Into the surface of the crude desk, the falcon had carved a glyph. It was a simple enough shape. 4 sides like a box, signifying strength. Inside the box, a shape, a triangle almost, but sharp and uneven, warped like bad iron. The shape looked like a tooth, a decaying tooth, sharp and brittle as a black bronze shiv. The glyph was from an old language, a language rarely seen or read nowadays, though there could be no doubt as to its meaning. Orc.